Welcome back, everybody. So we've been constructing a simple website starting with an HTML document, and then we added some CSS last week. And now we're going to start doing something a little bit more challenging. We're going to create a layout for this website using CSS. So what you're going to do is learn a simple new element of HTML called the div tag, and you're going to use the div tag to add CSS to particular sections of your HTML. And you'll see what I mean once we jump into the tutorial here. But what we're going to do is create a simple 4-column layout on your web page. And, you know, as they say, you've got to crawl before you can walk. So this isn't going to be a particularly complex layout of the document as we get started here, because that would be pretty challenging. So this week, we're just going to learn how to divide this up into 4 columns and do a little bit of CSS styling on what you've got so far, background color, heading color, etc., etc. And it'll give you a great jump start into what it's going to mean to create layouts for your websites. So let's jump into the tutorial here, and I'll be back in just a little bit. Okay, everybody, so let's take a look at using the div tags and CSS to create a layout for your site. We'll start off with just a basic one. So remember where we're at so far. This is the site that we have now. 4 different sections. For mine, I did bacon, cheese, veggies, and then the ranking where I used an ordered list, unordered list in the other sections. Here's the HTML for it as it's constructed so far. So the first thing I want to talk about is something called the box model. And the box model is sort of a template for understanding how the different elements inside of your site are structured in terms of the hierarchy of elements. So here's the actual content. In this case, it might be a paragraph. And then the next element out is going to be padding. Then you have the border, then the margin. So the margin is on the very outmost of the element that you've styled, and you can give properties for the top margin, bottom, right, and left. So top, bottom, right, and left. You can style all of those elements with regard to the margin. Then our border is right here, and the margin is, of course, doesn't really have features to it. It's just empty space and the size of that empty space, right? But your border can be dotted or dashed. It can be solid or double. And so you can style that here. So in this example, I'm saying I've got a 5-pixel solid green border. This doesn't really correspond to this border that I've got here completely. This is actually, you know, just inside of the this Google slide presentation. So it's not actually an HTML border, but you can absolutely create borders around any element that you create in your HTML. Then what we've got here is the padding. The padding is just the area around the content, between the content and the border. So in this example, the way that I'm doing the padding, it shows that the top is padded 25 pixels, then 50 is the right, the bottom is 75, and the left is 100. So that's the format you go: top, right, bottom, left. And I've designated this by pixel. Okay, so that's the box model, and you just need to understand that to understand what we're going to do next as we create a 4-column layout for your site. So let's go ahead and first just add a banner to the top of our site. So I'm going to go back over into the HTML. And remember that anything that's visible inside of the site is between the body tags. So let's just create an H1 or an H1 header that we'll use as a banner at the top of the page. So I'm going to go H1, and then I'm going to give this H1 a class, and we're going to style that class inside of the CSS. So let's call this class banner. So class equals banner, and I'll go down a few and close the H1 out. And then I just want to put in here what the banner is going to say, and I'll just put in good foods for the site that I'm making here. Okay. So, and I'm going to hit a space just to make it a little easier to read. So you see we've got the H1 class equals banner, and need to make sure I've got opening and closing quotation marks there. H1 class equals banner, the text that's going to be on the banner, and then let's close that out. All right, now let's go over to our CSS and style that banner. So I'm going to open up the CSS with my text editor, and there it is. And the first thing I'm going to do, so this styles all H1. So all H1 headers get styled by this, but I want to style this particular banner differently. And remember, we talked about previously, we talked about how to reference specific classes. Let's take a look here. So there's your selector, and to do a class, you're just going to do dot class name, and then you're going to put in your rules for styling it. So here I'm just going to go dot banner because I named it banner. So that's the name of the class. And let's do our opening curly bracket. And actually, we'll go ahead and do closing. And I'll hit enter a couple times and go right here. And now let's start putting in our rules. So the first thing is I don't want any margin around this banner. And so that's referring back to what we just covered with regard to the box model. I want the margin to be 0. If we look back over at what we just talked about, so I want this to be 0 around that banner. And but let's create a little bit of a border, and we'll have the border be, let's go 15 pixels. And let's make that border solid green. So it's going to be solid, and it's going to be green. And I will add that to it. Now, we're going to set the height and width property here. I want the width of this banner to go all the way across the screen. So right now, everything goes all the way across the screen, but we're going to make some changes as we make this a 4-column page. So in order to handle that, we need to make the width of this 100%. So I'm going to go width, %. Semicolon to close that out. And I want this banner to be the inverse of the H1 banners we've done so far. So instead of color being green and the background color being light blue, I'm going to reverse that. So I'm just copying the rule for H1 headers, pasting it here. Then I'm going to reverse this. So I'm going to go make that green. And this light blue. So color is light blue, background color is green. So that's going to be the inverse of the headers that we've got everywhere else, okay? So that's going to style this banner. So I'm going to save this CSS. Now if I go over here and I refresh, let's say I'll go open the index, open with Safari. There it is. Okay, so now it's going to look like this. See how it's the inverse? It goes 100% of the way across. So now I've created a little banner at the top of my web page. Now, instead of having 4 rows here of content, I'm going to restyle the format on this page to give me 4 columns that are going to go across. So let's start doing that. And in order to do that, we need to talk about divs. Okay, and divs are an HTML element. And this is your tag in the HTML. And essentially, the div tag defines a division or section of the HTML document. And the div element's often used as a container for HTML elements so that you can style them more easily. You could also use the divs to add JavaScript functionality, but we're going to use the divs right now in particular to style elements of our web page. So all we're going to do here is we're going to add divs, and we're going to call the div columns, okay? So at the as soon as I'm done with this banner here, I'm going to add the div. So I'm going to style every element of the page except for the banner. I don't want the banner to be a part of the 4 columns, so I'm not placing it inside of the div tag. So I'm going to first create this div tag. And this would be an opening div tag, but I want to also give this a class just the way that I did H1. So I'm going to go here, class equals, class equals, and let's give a name to the class, and we will name it banner. Okay, I don't want that space there. Not banner, rather, columns. COLUMN. Okay, so we're going to call this div column. And then we're going to go all the way to the bottom of the body. And I'm going to close out that div using the backslash just as we do when we close out any other div. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now I'm ready to go back over to my CSS and add the columns. But before we do that, I want to explain something called floating, because I'm going to have to do some floats to make this work. So this is the CSS to create something called a float. And what a float does is actually float something to the left or the right of the screen. So if you have content and you want it to be on the left side, you'll add this CSS, float left, and then when it renders, it'll stick it to this side of the page. If you put in float right, it'll stick it to the right side of the page, okay? Now, there's more that you can do with this float tag, but for now, let's just think about it this way. So if I put this in there and let's take a look at the HTML at the moment, just the way that it is. And let's do something. I'm going to go into my CSS. And let's do this to all images just for a second, then I'll get rid of it. So images and open and closing. And then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to add just this HTML. So float, let's do float right because everything's kind of on the left right now. So go back over here and that, and we're going to float all images to the right. Okay, and let's save this CSS. Go over to the site and look what happens. Okay, see how it even overlaps what's there, but it just floats to the right if I put that in. Now, if I go back and float it to the left, and save. Now, if I go back over here, bam. Okay, so that's what it's like if I floated on the left. So that's what float does. Now, I don't want to do that with my images, but we're going to need to use that float value in order to make columns. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this because I don't want to do that. And go back over here, and now we're back normal again, okay? So let's add our columns now. So I created that column div, and we need to now style the CSS of the columns and the column class, because we made that we made the column its own class, or that div, which is everything in the site except for this banner. We made a class called columns. So let's go ahead and style that class. So dot column, which is the name of the class, and then opening, closing right here, and let's float each column to the left. And then from there, we're going to set the width of each column. Now, I don't want them to be as 4 columns, a percentage of the screen would be 25% each. But I'm going to have some padding around each of the columns, and that will eat up some of the space. So I don't want to use the full 25% for each column. If you don't have padding, it will jam the text next to each other and not look very good. So let's go ahead and do that. And let me show you what I mean. So if I decide to set the width of each column at 25%, okay, so that's going to give us 4 columns. And I'll save this. Now watch what happens here. All right, what'd I mess up? Float left, width 25%, padding. I think, let me see what I did. Okay, so right now I have only one element that's in the div class column that's going to be, the entire thing is going to be 25%. So what I need to do is for each section of the HTML, I need that opening and closing div class. Okay, so what I mean by that is this. Div class equals column. Is I've got that at the beginning of the bacon section, right? So let's add that to the beginning of the cheese section. Now let's add it to the beginning of the veggie section. Let's add that to the beginning of that list section. Okay, now I've got this one closed out, but let's close out those other divs. So I'll need that at the end of each section. I'll need to have that closing div also. So I'm placing that here. And need to place it here. Make sure I'm getting all of these in. So essentially, there's 4 sections to this HTML document, right? And I need to make each of them their own division called of the column class. All right. So the header is, or rather the banner at the top, that's separate. It's not one of these divs. Okay. Because we don't want to style it as one of the 4 columns. We've decided to style it to go 100% of the way across the page. But here's our first one, div class column, and that starts at the beginning of the bacon section, right? And then we go all the way down to the bottom of this bacon section, and there it is closing out, okay? So then now we're starting the cheese section. So we're opening another div class column with this tag, and then we make our way down to the bottom of the cheese section, and there it is closing out. So now we are in the veggie section, so we're creating another div class called column, and there's that opening tag for the div class column. And we go down to the bottom of the veggie section, and there it is closing that out. And then the 4th section is going to be the ranking of the food. So here's the div class opening that up, and there's the div tag closing it. Okay, so let's save this. Then go back over here, and let's refresh and see what we get. Okay, so now we've created 4 columns. And each of them looks like this. So in our CSS, if we take a look at the CSS, you can see that I've said that the columns each are going to be 25% of the screen wide, and they're going to float to the left. If I change them so they float to the right, all it's going to do is populate them from that direction. Okay, so it's now if I save this, so bacon is the first thing in the HTML, and it's floating to the left, so it goes bam and snaps to the left side. Then when the cheese gets rendered, it's floated left too, so it snaps as far left as it can go without covering up what's already there, right? It snaps to the leftmost available part of the screen. But now I change them to float right, and you'll see now the bacon comes here and then the cheese. All it does is change the order, okay? So, I mean, obviously I could just leave the site that way, but let's change it back to left. Save that CSS. Okay, so now we've created our 4 columns. So let's just use that CSS and style this a little bit more. Watch, it's going to be back to normal now. Okay, so let's just add a little bit more styling to the site. And the way we want to do that is let's add a little background color. So we will change this to the entire body of the script. Instead of having this white background, let's sort of do a little more color coordination and style the body of what we've got here. So we're going to go body, opening and closing tags, and I'm going to change the background color to, we're going to go with it like a light green, which is actually, we looked at the different names for CSS colors. And I like this color right here, so we're going to use the color name pale green. closing there. Now look, the spell check actually tried to break my code there. We go there, file, save. Now if I go back over here and refresh, so now I have a nice pale green background color. So we've started to style this site a little bit. So now I've got this banner at the top that says Good Foods. I've gone to 4 columns, and I've made it a little bit more cohesive by adding this green background color. But what I don't like here is look at the way the text all kind of mashes into stuff next to it. So we need to go ahead and use this box model that we were discussing to make it look a little better. And what I want to do is add some padding, so some space around the content. So I'm going to go back over to my CSS, and inside of the column class, I'm going to add another characteristic, padding. And the padding is going to be 25 pixels. And I'm going to do it for each of the areas of the padding. So top, bottom, left, and right. And all I have to do is just place it in this way. I'm going to use 25 pixels for each. So sometimes you're going to want it to be different for the top and bottom than it is for the left and the right. But that's not what we've got or what I want to do here. So I'm just going to leave it like that. And remember, I've got to add my closing semicolon, and it looks like we're in good shape here. So I'll go File, Save, go back over to the site, and let's see how that makes it look. Oh yeah, that's a lot nicer, except I didn't have the screen stretched out far enough to have it all showing in. And remember I talked about how 25% was not going to work for this if I have padding added. So I'm going to change the width now from 25% because the padding eats up some of the space. Okay, so I'm going to change the width of each to 22%. The padding is not, the content is what is taking up 25% of the screen. So what happens is when you add this extra 25 pixels on each side, you actually go further than the length of the total length of your rendered area. And so it has to put this on the next row down because it's 25% also. So you've got 25, 25, 25, but you've also got so you don't have 25% of the screen left to render all of this that you've said needs to be 25% because you've used some of the percent of the screen to add in the padding. So I'm going to switch my CSS to be just 22% instead of 25%. And I'm going to save. Now when I go ahead and refresh, I have room for this. And so here you go. Now if I shrink the screen too much, it won't fit anymore. But when we use, a reasonable width, we can style out this way. We've got the padding on the side, which makes the text more readable. I mean, it's lorem ipsum, so it's not particularly readable, but it makes it readable enough. So I want you to do something like this with the site you've got so far. I want you to create 4 columns. I want you to create a banner at the top. I want you to use some box model elements to make things readable and look good. And I want you to do just a little bit of styling to your site to add some CSS so you start to have a more evolved website. So that's div tags, box modeling, and some simple CSS to start creating a layout for your website. Okay, so that's a little introduction to the div tag and CSS as used for creating a layout of your page. So I want you to do the same thing this week. You're just going to create a simple 4-column page with a banner at the top. Follow along with what I did before, and feel free to use creativity. If you can expand upon what I did here a little bit, that's fine, or kind of create your own sort of feel to your page. Make sure to add some padding and margin in where you feel it is applicable to make sure that the 4 columns look good and that the banner looks good. So I look forward to seeing your work, and just check out the specific assignment as it's written up for any more specifics about what I want you to do this week.